So, Fred, you missed it. I was just testing out audio that I can just insert in, like so. Recall Roundup intro, Tau intro, and the show intro. You guys ready for it? Because I got a new show intro. Here we go. Ooh. You're listening to There Ought to Be a Law, the Center for Auto Safety podcast with Executive Director Michael Brooks, Chief Engineer Fred Perkins, and hosted by me, Anthony Cimino. For over 50 years, the Center for Auto Safety has worked to make cars safer.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful.
I like it.
Gets a little loud there at the end, but hey, listeners, welcome to season 2. We'll call it season 2 because, this is episode 53, but, you don't have to catch up on all 52 episodes. It's not like Lost. It is like Lost in that we're making it up as we go along. That's an old reference, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, it's like one of those sitcoms where you can just catch any episode and you're caught up to speed. You don't have to follow the plot from day one.
But the plot is pretty much the same here. Let's start off with our continuing long story about driverless cars, Waymo, Cruise, and San Francisco. So as we've mentioned in the past, voters, residents of places like San Francisco and Seattle, Washington, want control over how cars are run in their city. I know it's naive, this idea of democracy, but it's adorable. But states like California are like, nope, we're going to override what you want to do in your municipalities. Washington, same thing. Good luck. But now there was a vote scheduled by the California Public Utilities Commission that would allow unlimited expansion of GM Cruise and Waymo robot taxis on public streets. But this has been postponed to further review. And historically, this is just something that just happens and it goes through. No one notices it. But Waymo has been causing issues with the police. GM Cruise has been blocking fire trucks, and now people are getting a little annoyed with it, including the fire chief of San Francisco, who says that the fire department of San Francisco since January 1st has logged at least 39 robo-taxi incident reports. Ugh. So,
well, Anthony, can you explain to me why it's a bad idea for uncrewed vehicles to be blocking fire trucks? Because it doesn't seem to be obvious to everybody.
Oh, let's see. Got a fire going along. This robo-taxi rolls over my fire hose, blocks the flow of water there, and now we can't move it out of the way. There's no one to talk to. There's no one to signal. There's no international sign language for, get your vehicle off my fire hose. That's one reason.
So that's generally bad performance on the part of the cruise vehicle. Is that?
Well, I think it's poor design on the building codes in San Francisco. Why haven't they made all their buildings out of asbestos? It won't burn.
Well, that's true. That would save a lot, wouldn't it, if they just made all the buildings fireproof?
Yeah.
And earthquake-proof.
Yeah. It's their fault for design. They designed a system that requires a fire department. You're just planning for failure right there.
That's planned obsolescence, isn't it? They're going to burn down.
Absolutely. Michael?
So they've delayed a vote on this. It appears because there's been some significant public opposition to the expansion of the services that Cruise and Waymo are attempting to offer there. This is about 2 weeks, I believe, after the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Authority, am I getting that right? SFMTA. Kind of pushed back on and put out a document, based on their data saying that Cruise is about 6.3 times more dangerous than a human driver. And that basically, they may have met the requirements in California to get a learner's permit, but they haven't gotten to where they could get an actual driver's license, which, as we all know, even bad drivers get often. So it's certainly not a glowing review. And it's the Public Utilities Commission in California is in charge of this process, and San Francisco has to go to them and to the state to get things done on its streets, which is problematic. And I think we referred to it last week and speaking about how, the AV industry and their lobby are trying to basically make states, cities, and the federal government powerless all at the same time, through all types of preemption and other legal maneuvers, while continuing to tout these benefits of these vehicles that we don't see, for the disabled and for other communities yet. For the firefighter community, they are causing a lot of problems. I think Waymo even ran over a dog a couple of weeks ago.
Oh.
So it's just continuing to be rolled out without really any public data being provided to show that these vehicles are safe. Now, we've talked about how Waymo is putting out data on crashes and incidents and is doing a really good job of that. What it appears they're missing is how their vehicles are affecting traffic when they go into, what we've called a state of confusion or an existential crisis, where they just can't figure out what to do and they stop in the middle of the road, and how that affects everyone around them. While they might not be, running over and killing humans or causing massive injuries yet, they're not really focused on the other impacts that they're having on the streets of San Francisco, which we've talked about ad nauseum, and the chief among those appear to be some of the firefighters' complaints, because they're the ones responding to accident scenes. Plus, they're the ones who, when they respond to house fires, are having their hoses and their operations threatened by vehicles without a driver in them. So we are firmly on the side local authorities being able to determine what types of vehicles are able to operate on their streets, particularly in situations like this where there are traffic and safety consequences.
Michael, has anybody ever, let me just ask, has anybody ever shown that any individual human being anywhere has ever saved time, money, or hazard by using an self-driving vehicle?
I can't imagine that data is even available, if it exists, and I don't think it does.
And he really furrowed his brow when answering that, so he gave it some thought.
I telegraph when I'm actually using my brain. That's good.
We used to in the old days, we used to call that vaporware. Anthony, is vaporware still something that's a current term, or has that moved on?
Vaporware is definitely still a thing. But Michael, Waymo says that it was disappointed by the commission's delay and that its data to date has shown no collisions involving pedestrians or cyclists. We're going to ignore city buses, other vehicles.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the tunnel vision that they're referring to, the SFMTA or SFMTA. I'll get it right one day. That's what they're referring to. They're saying, well, yeah, you're focused on, you're doing good on the safety side of the actual vehicle operating and not hitting things. But what you're not really getting right is when the vehicle can't operate and is blocking traffic, blocking emergency vehicles, things like where the vehicle is dropping off passengers and a number of other issues that show that there's still a long way to go. While these vehicles might be able to operate safely and under limited circumstances on city streets, they're not quite doing it in a way that's helping the city. They're creating more congestion and more problems. And so inevitably, I think we all need to ask, what's the point? And we've asked this before, what's the point of having these things on the roads in your city if they're only causing problems? And you're basically becoming a test ground, and you're absorbing some of the negatives of the rollout of these vehicles, and you're not getting anything in return. So it's, I think it's going to end up costing San Francisco more money to have these vehicles in its city. So they need to see some corresponding benefits. I don't think they're getting that yet.
Well, it's interesting because GM Cruise, they mentioned how a bunch of disability rights groups have sent letters in support. And so I asked a friend of mine who's blind about this. I said, wouldn't it make more sense that you'd actually have a driver there to help you if you need in and out? I mean, make sure you're getting to the door and whatnot. And what he said to me was interesting. He said, it's about having kind of not having to rely on other people. He said, so the dream is that that I could own a vehicle like this, not as a taxi service, but that one day I could own a vehicle like this and I can have independence and get around without having to rely on others. But he freely admits that this future probably will never occur. So they're kind of playing this fictitious straw man that maybe, hey, in the future, where everything will be better, in 20, 30 years, when we have all of this figured out, and that it's cheap enough for you to actually own these vehicles, that it's a good thing. Whereas ignoring the reality of today, the cars will threaten the police. I mean,
it's tough, and that is the number one thing I hear from when we've read the comments from the groups representing the blind. They say that their independence is really the number one thing for them. They don't want to have to rely on another driver, or if you're like me and you have a streak of you're a little misanthrope, you want your time to yourself, and I can see where that's super important to people, and so I get it. But yes, like you, I just can't. First of all, from the ownership perspective, I don't know that ownership of these things is ever truly going to be possible. We'll see. The robo-taxi idea, maybe. That's certainly what everyone's pushing from Tesla on up. But it's going to be a long time,
right.
particularly if they can't resolve some of these human vehicle problem interactions with firefighters and that type of thing, because putting this system into play on the streets where we're already having problems. We already have a pedestrian crisis. We already having so many different transportation issues. AVs are not solving them right now. There's very little benefit and a lot of drawbacks to having them on the road at this moment. And, I think as they roll out into more cities, you're going to see more locals come out like this. And hopefully we listen to the people and not to the billions of dollars in corporate money that's funding these experiments.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing to me. And I just think of the example, I think it was Waymo a couple weeks ago, we talked about, where the reporter tried to use it and it wouldn't drop him off at his location. It slowed down, pulled over, and then sped off to some other location. I mean, how frightening would that be? Especially if, you have any sort of disability, like you're trying to get out, you're moving. But, hey, everything will be better and these cars make the world safer. Can you smell that sarcasm, listener? Because if you can, you should go to autosafety.org and donate, and we'll send you whole packets of sarcasm. Actually, we're not going to send you anything. It's a charity. It's a nonprofit charity. Okay, you're making it. You get some sort of tax benefit. I'm not a tax lawyer or an accountant. I don't know how it works, but you should donate, and then we'll continue with the conversation about how the roads are becoming very dangerous for pedestrians. America was a dangerous place to be a pedestrian in 2022. Preliminary data analyzed by the Governor's Highway Safety Association, everyone's got their own safety association, found that 7,508 pedestrians were killed in traffic crashes last year, the highest numbers of deaths since 1981. Amazing. And the thing is, it points out that most of these deaths, where the massive increase has been in states Arizona, Virginia, Oregon, Tennessee, Wisconsin. But streets that surprisingly have gotten safer are D.C., Montana, which Montana I don't even think has a speed limit, New York, New Jersey, of all places. It's amazing. And we've talked about this, about how pedestrians are people too.
Yeah, there's just so many issues involved here. We've talked about the threat to pedestrians from the heavier vehicles, from the larger in stature vehicles. There are just dozens of issues behind this. We've started to see a lot of distraction causing these incidents, both by drivers and by pedestrians, just like we see in pedestrian incidents. We see a lot of inebriated or drunk drivers, and there are also inebriated pedestrians. I've seen, a lot of blame cast towards infrastructure as part of the problem, road designs, streets lacking sidewalks, proper places to cross. And there are a lot of technological solutions there that state highway departments and cities can put in place to solve some of these issues. and there are either funding issues or, frankly, motivational or just a desire to get these type of things done is a problem in some states. So there are many, many problems here that are causing this issue with pedestrians, and you have to attack every one of them. I mean, one of those issues is making sure that vehicles don't continue to grow in stature so much that what is a 30-mile-per-hour collision now killing a pedestrian doesn't become 20 because the weight of the vehicles have increased so much. So it's a disaster. It's a crisis, and it's ongoing, and the numbers are going up every year, and they're going up in relation to the overall total of fatalities on our roads. We have had increase in the last few years in fatalities on our roads, but the increase there hasn't been nearly as significant as what we've seen in the area of pedestrians being killed. I believe there's been a 75% rise in the last decade or so in the number of pedestrians killed, which is enormous. And it strikes me that we should be able to find some solutions to this by, just seeing what's happened since in the last 10 years. And obviously, distracted driving, heavy vehicles have become a bigger problem. We've also seen, there's certain places where this tends to happen too. Like you mentioned, Oregon, there's, a staggeringly large number of the pedestrians that are struck in Oregon are homeless or unhoused people who are living on the streets, and it makes sense that they might be exposed to more risk, but that's a huge problem as well. Addressing things you wouldn't think of it this way, but addressing a crisis like homelessness can impact the number of pedestrians that are killed each year. So there really are a lot of issues here that can and should be resolved if only we have the political will to do it.
Well,
right. Fundamentally, most of the people are being killed at night and by cars that are going too fast, and or drunk drivers. So those are the major factors that I saw in there, Michael. Short term, what needs to happen is the speeding cars need to be kept separate from the pedestrians, and that's the fundamental perspective behind the zero fatality initiatives that are going on around the world. That requires investment in structures and investment by the public in separating the speeding vehicles from the pedestrians. One part of that is to make sure the cars go slower with various kinds of construction, speed bumps, speed humps, what have you. But longer term, you're exactly right. The long-term solution is for people's behavior to change, particularly people who have no choice but to be on the streets, and getting them away from the vehicles and getting the vehicles to slow down so that they're not an inherent hazard to the people on the street. It may be a big ask, but I think this is coupled with the whole idea of energy efficiency, reducing carbon footprints, basically redesigning transportation systems in some respects so that people use their cars less, use them more efficiently, and don't use them in areas that threaten human beings.
So where does that limit car use to?
I'm sorry, what?
Where does that limit car use to? So if it's not going to threaten humans anywhere. So
limited access highways are relatively safe. There's very few pedestrian accidents and collisions on limited access highways. There are very few pedestrian accidents on streets where vehicles are prohibited. A lot of cities now are moving towards areas where pedestrians are the focus and the vehicles are the exception. You can do that with appropriate means for having people park their cars, use various other kinds of public ways to get into the city, walking, bicycles, moving sidewalks, who knows? There's a lot of ways of doing that. It's happening in Europe. Copenhagen's a good example. Amsterdam, Rotterdam. I understand all those cities have got very, very low pedestrian deaths, and yet life continues for the people who own cars. So I think there are ways to do it, Anthony, but it needs the will and it needs the public commitment.
I'm seeing it in my own neighborhood where they've closed off entire streets, and this is all pedestrian thoroughfare now. I've actually contacted the New York City Department of Transportation and asked for a speed hump right outside my window because there's a traffic light there, and they it's not a traffic light, it's the starting line of a drag race every 5 minutes. It is literally a drag race, and it's not a far race. They've raced to basically to the where the street goes from 2 lanes to 1 lanes to get onto a highway.
Oh, that's
And
one of those. Yeah.
yeah, and the city has written back and they're like, "No, we've done a study. It's not needed." And I'm like, "What? I've done a study too. I hear people crash their cars constantly here." But anyway,
I think you just want to pick up on the extra catalytic converters that fall on the ground when they hit them too fast, right?
hey, look, platinum, it's the future. So in this article that we're linking to, this is I think kind of what we've been talking about, but quoting from it, even before electrification, the weight of passenger vehicles has been rising. In 1980, the average weight of a car was about 3,200 pounds. Now it is 4,200 pounds, just like the average weight of an American. An increase of 31%. And over the past 2 decades, the average weight of a pickup truck rose by 24%. Studies show that for every 1,000-pound increase in vehicle weight, there is a 46% increase in motorist fatalities. Oh my God! So you got to add in the car gained 1,000 pounds. The driver
and
gained 100.
those are ICE vehicles. That's pre-electrification. So right now we're dropping another 1,500 or 2,000 pounds in the heavier vehicles, and a few hundred, if not 1,000, in a lot of other vehicles. So those rates went up slowly over time. Now they're going to go up even quicker.
But I mean, physics, is it a real thing or is it just a myth?
Well, physics is a real thing. Yeah. And, the fundamental physics are that the lighter object in a collision is going to suffer a disproportionate amount. And, getting hit by a train at 60 miles an hour is probably worse than getting hit by a car at 60 miles an hour. Neither one's good. But I think the key is that some of this analysis done so far in the research is that fatalities occur most often when a vehicle speed exceeds 25 miles per hour. Isn't that right?
Yes.
You've done that work.
That's one of the reasons why you see so many more crashes, pedestrian fatalities on arterial roads where you have a lot, stop lights and crossings, but you also have speed limits of 40 plus miles per hour.
Right. So, the question is, would somebody be more injured by a heavier vehicle at 25 miles per hour than they are by a lighter vehicle at 25 miles per hour? I'm not sure that study's been done. I think that the statistics you were talking about are correlation rather than causality.
Yeah. And it's hard to do that because vehicles have different shapes that impact pedestrians in different ways, right?
Right. And happily, NHTSA is starting to consider including pedestrian protection in the NCAP ratings. So that's good. That's happening in parallel. But really, there's no substitute from keeping vulnerable road users away from speeding cars. That's the fundamental change that's got to take place.
So let's tie these two subjects together. We did self-driving cars, we did road safety, and let's pull them all together with this opinion piece from the Washington Post talking about how Elon Musk likes to claim that his cars running autopilot are unequivocally safer. Yet I'm not going to show you the data. Quoting from this article, post-investigation reveals that the number of deaths and serious injuries associated with Tesla's driver assistant technology is greater than previously reported. The most recent accounting by NHTSA includes 736 crashes since 2019, at least 17 of them fatal. Oh my God.
Well, speaking of correlation and not causality, those numbers are from the Standing General Order, which is not a direct connection from the driver assistance Tesla's reporting crashes. There's not a causative relationship between the crash and the level 2+ system, whatever they're calling it. They are autopilot, full self-driving. It's actually all crashes involving Teslas where that tech was turned on. So it's, I think the harder numbers are going to be determined by some of the NHTSA special investigation teams that have gone to all these Tesla crashes and have now been holding on to their reports for 6 years or so, instead of releasing them publicly. That's where the real data will come from, where you'll actually be able to see, what this crash, the autopilot did not recognize X, Y, and Z, and ran into a highway barrier, that type of thing. Here, the standing general order just reports crashes that occur while autopilot was on, and in fact, the reporting is bad from Tesla because they're withholding information like whether autopilot and full self-driving were, which one was being used. They're withholding the crash narrative, which is critical to understanding what happened. I mean, if autopilot is on and a car flies off of a overpass above it and lands on the Tesla, it's obviously not the Tesla's fault, yet that crash would still be reported in this data. So I just want to put that out as a word of caution when you're reading some of these statistics, that there's not a direct correlation there, but there's, a lot of smoke, and where there's smoke, we know what's going on.
Canada's on fire. That's what's going on. So we talk a lot about recalls in this show, and we have a good article from I'm not even going to try and pronounce the name of this newspaper, but the link's in the description. And it basically talks about how regulations are better than recalls for vehicles, because we always talk about, NHTSA, they recalled 1 million vehicles, but only six people were injured. That's a ridiculous thing, where people don't realize that, it's to prevent future things. But hey, if there were actual regulations in place, auto manufacturers would design to that. So this article talks about the tragic death of the Star Trek actor who died in 2015 when his Jeep Grand Cherokee rolled backwards on his driveway and pinned him against a brick fence. But Michael, what?
So it's an editorial. It's Norma Hubel, who is actually also known as the auto professor. I believe she works at I think it's Arizona State, and she also, importantly, and this is something I think all of our listeners should check out. If they go to the autoprofessor.com, she goes back, and her team go back and they look at NHTSA crash data, and you can go to her site and pick out your make, model, and year, or a car you might be shopping for, and look up, some of the actual things that happen, or you get actual ratings because they're based on crash data. And the cool thing about it is you can also select your age and gender to see how the vehicle that you're looking at performed based on your own age or gender. So that's a really cool feature. And I would tell consumers that's someplace else they should go when they're going to, NHTSA or Insurance Institute or Consumer Reports for ratings. It might be a good thing also to check out Norma's site and see how that matches up. But she's absolutely correct about, the problem with recalls. And we talk about recalls all the time. We love recalls because they get dangerous cars off the road. But what we don't love about recalls is that they're a retrospective action. They occur after these things have started to happen, after people have been killed or injured. And, we think there should be standards put in place before those things happen. And a recent example would be something like Teslas are having phantom braking problems, and they're stopping. And, we saw a crash in the Bay Area recently that involved this Tesla thinking it sees something, stopping in the middle of the road and then causing a crash. That is, something that we think could be ameliorated or fixed or corrected or made better by regulations from NHTSA before Tesla puts this vehicle out on the road. Software standards and automatic emergency braking standards and sensor standards, all of those things could combine to make sure that phantom braking incidents happen, a lot less than they appear to be happening in the vehicle population right now. We've been seeing them for years in Nissans and Toyotas, and now in a lot of other vehicles. So we'll probably see more of that over the years as automatic emergency braking develops, as pedestrian automatic emergency braking develops. But in a nutshell, if you can get those standards in place and manufacturers have to follow them at the time of manufacture and eliminate issues like that, then you don't have to come back and do recalls after people have been injured or killed. Which is a very important point, particularly when we're looking at autonomous vehicles. And NHTSA and the DOT have continued to maintain for about 7 years now that they're going to be conducting a lot of their safety efforts in this area through recalls, which, seeing how slowly they've responded to Tesla and seeing how slowly they've responded to a number of other complex issues and technical issues, doesn't give me a lot of hope that their recall and investigative process is going to be able to address, rapidly developing issues in autonomous vehicles that involve highly complex software and things that you can't just see. So that's basically, in a nutshell, I think what Norma's article speaks to, and it's essentially a call to for more action by the DOT and by NHTSA to prevent this, the recall system from being the only protector of the American public.
What lies behind this is, and essentially underwrites the current process, is that all of these are engineered products. And engineered products need to be developed, right? They don't just grow on trees. The system engineering is a part of any engineering development process. And in system engineering, the fundamental thing that you do when you develop an engineered product is to come up with a set of requirements. If you do not have a set of requirements that specify a certain behavior, that behavior is only going to end up accidentally in the product. So what that means is, unless you've got specific requirements that say certain things have to happen, that phantom braking cannot occur, that the car cannot turn into a vulnerable road user, any number of other things. Anything that is not required can only happen by accident. Now, the other side of this is that if you find after the engineering development is complete that you need a certain behavior or a certain aspect of the design that's not included, it is very, very expensive to go back and do that. So that's the downside for the manufacturers of relying upon the recalls at NHTSA to determine what their design requirements should be. Very, very expensive to implement at that time. And in fact, what we've seen is that the companies come back and say, well, hell, I can't do that. It's too expensive. I can't change all these airbag inflators. It's too expensive. I can't change all of these brittle bolts that are holding my rear axle in place. It's just too expensive to do that. If they had instead put in those requirements at the beginning of their development, it wouldn't be an issue. It would never have to be corrected. It would never have to be corrected as part of a recall, because that recall would not happen. So I'm with Michael on this, and I want to point out to our listeners that any such problems are generally a defect in the system engineering process by the company that's building the product. People know how to do this. People know how to do system engineering. The marketing and the financial people get involved in this. And, you've got to give Elon Musk credit for knowing how to finance things that are going to be engineering developments. He does that probably better than anybody else. But it's not the job of people who are in finance to determine what the requirements for the engineering development have to be based upon the safety of the resultant product. There's got to be a different process. And NHTSA is the only group, the only organization that's in a position to put those requirements in place for safety that may not be in the best financial interest of a company, but that are in the best interest of public safety. NHTSA is the one, and they've got to step up to it. And right now, their position is that they're just going to wait for something to happen and then try to put a fix in after the fact. It's not good for people. It's not good for the companies.
Listen, Fred, as somebody who works in the finance department, okay, this $1 piece that you're telling me is required for engineering will save lives. But if you're buying a Ford Pinto, you can't really afford to spend that extra dollar. Sure, not everybody's going to make it, but hey, you'll have that extra dollar in your pocket.
I had a Pinto. I lived to tell the tale.
Did you?
I did so far.
Speaking of proposed rules, and this is a good thing, NHTSA and some other alphabet soup of an acronym of a federal group, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, announced announced a
Anthony.
notice of proposed rulemaking, and that also has an acronym, the NPRM. So let's do this: NHTSA, FMCSA, NPRM. I feel like I'm doing a routine from like Robin Williams in Good Morning Vietnam. So
Use your words, Anthony. Use your words.
They're not using words. They're just like, hey, let's take a bunch of complex words, jam them together, and then just throw out the words. So anyway, long story short, there's a proposed rule that heavy trucks have to have automatic emergency braking. This is a good thing? Yes.
It's definitely a good thing. We actually petitioned for this action in 2015, so 8 years ago. And we were petitioning, at a time when the technology wasn't advanced as it is now. And this is obviously they take a long time on rulemakings, particularly ones of this magnitude, and particularly when they've got the trucking industry barking down their neck all the time, telling them that this stuff is too expensive and it's going to destroy their industry, which is rarely true. The rule is good. It protects up to about 50 miles per hour, which is I think one of my personal big problems with it, because a lot of the catastrophic crashes that we hear about occur at speeds above that. For instance, the one that injured Tracy Morgan, killed his friend and fellow comedian, and severely injured a couple other people when a Walmart truck hit them in their Sprinter van, I believe, Sprinter limo, at about 65 miles per hour. Nothing would change in that crash under this rule. So given the number of vehicles that are traveling our interstates at high speeds, a number of heavy trucks, it's great that they're protecting at 50 miles per hour. They've had a long time to get at this point, and this isn't even going to be in effect until 2029, probably at the earliest.
Why so long?
We wait another 2 decades to get it to actual highway speeds. The process is just far too slow, and it's because the industry doesn't place any value on it, because it costs them a little money, and they're unable to see the great benefit in protecting the public.
Look, again, as a representative of the finance department, you're asking us to spend $1.15 that the marketing department can't figure out how to sell to make us $1.16 on it. So look, not everyone's going to survive. Speaking of I've stumped Michael.
I'm speechless for a moment. That's unusual for me.
But
yeah,
I
don't like this new finance guy, Fred. I think we need to can him.
You can't afford to can me. Hey, Fred, how are you doing?
Not bad for an older person.
Okay, that's good. So let's go into the Tao of Fred.
You've now entered the Tao of Fred.
All right, so we got a few spot quizzes for you today. Why do you typically rev up your engine before you start from a stop?
I don't.
You don't.
I just have bad pedal skills.
Bad pedal skills.
Why would I hear the jackasses outside my window starting at the racing point do that?
I do know the answer to this. I just realized torque.
Torque. Well, there's a couple answers actually. Now, fundamentally, how much torque does your internal combustion engine generate at 0 RPM?
Zero
torque.
Zero torque, 0 RPM. That's right. Good. You win a point, Michael. Now,
I said zero torque too. Come on.
Yeah, but you were slow. You didn't hit the buzzer in time.
Oh, God damn it.
But okay, so there's a difference with an electric motor. How much torque does an electric motor produce at 0 RPM?
Torque. Zero torque.
And Michael?
At 0 RPM, it's not moving, right? So no, 0. I would have to say 0 there too.
And okay,
all the torque, all of
it. Yeah, electric motor produces maximum torque at 0 RPM. So that's an interesting difference between the two, and that leads to a lot of other considerations. So your internal combustion engine produces no torque at 0 RPM, so it has to be running in order for it to produce any torque. And it goes from zero efficiency at idle, because it's just idling, right, up to some other number where it gets maximum efficiency. That is associated with what's called the torque peak. So the peak torque of an internal combustion engine typically occurs at something like 2,500 to 3,000 RPM. If you have an engine that doesn't have any modifications for flattening the torque peak, it has a very narrow speed at which it can operate efficiently. So when you have a typical car, they want to have a flat torque peak because they want to be able to maneuver and increase the speed and do all the things they do over fairly wide range of speeds. But you still need a transmission because that range is like a factor of 3. And if you compare that to the speed of the car over its entire operating range, it's a much wider operating range, going from 0 to X, we'll say 70 miles an hour. Okay, so in order to have reasonable performance, you've got to be able to keep the car operating at an efficient speed range. So you've got to match the speed of the car to the speed of the wheels.
Okay, I just want to point out for listeners that we didn't mention the subject of this week's Tao of Fred is why internal combustion engines need a transmission and electric vehicles don't. Nothing to do with Peter Tork or the monkeys.
Yeah. So, yeah. Many of you have been in a diesel truck. And if you've ever seen even a movie of a diesel truck, you know that they're shifting all the time, right?
Right.
The reason they're shifting all the time is because these trucks are built to have a very narrow torque peak, because they run at basically most efficient speed for very long periods of time. So because of the way the engines are designed, there's a very narrow range of engine speeds that gives them the torque they need to actually go ahead and accelerate the engine. That's why you have a lot of different speeds. You don't need that in the electric vehicle so much because it starts with maximum torque. And then what happens is interesting. It cannot speed up to an infinite speed. As the electric motor builds up speed, you get something called a reverse EMF. Now, an electric motor is basically a coil of wire that is allowed to spin in a magnetic field. An electric generator is the same thing. Just it's a question of, are you putting electricity in or you're taking electricity out? So you can see that there's a close relationship between a motor and a generator. What happens with a motor is that as it speeds, it actually becomes a generator and generates reverse voltage, or reverse EMF it's called, so that at maximum torque at 0 speed starts to peter out as you get up to higher and higher speeds. So this is just completely different than an internal combustion engine, which has a fairly flat torque peak, or maybe not a flat torque peak. But I'm going to ask you a spot quiz here too. What's the relationship between torque and power?
Oh, wait, you got to do that again. You froze for a second. You said, what's the difference between torque and frozen?
What is the relationship between torque and horsepower?
All the torque.
All the torque.
Torque and horsepower.
What's the relationship between them?
Well, if you got a riding crop and you got those boots and those, what's it called, the jumpers.
Michael, over to you.
I have no idea on this one, Fred. I would say the higher, I don't know, the higher the torque, the greater the horsepower.
Yeah.
Well, that's true. There's a linear relationship there. The basic relationship between torque and horsepower is that torque times the RPM gives you the horsepower. So if you have let's say that you had an engine that has a very flat torque range, right? Has the same torque from 0 to X RPM, then the horsepower increases linearly as you go to a higher engine speed, right? Because the horsepower is the function of torque and the engine speed. So In a typical car, though, your torque peak occurs at a much lower number than the maximum horsepower. So that's the reason why at cruise in a car, at efficient cruise, you're down at 2,500 RPM, something like that. So you never cruise at maximum horsepower. Because maximum horsepower occurs at some much higher number. And I looked at one in particular, a V8 produced by Ford in their Mustang something, what is it, Ford 2023 Mustang GT Fastback. It produces torque peak at 4,250 RPM, but the horsepower peak is 6,500 RPM. Now, it's interesting because the horsepower to weight ratio of that vehicle is 241 horsepower to ton of vehicle. And I sort of looked at the container ship, and a container ship has a ratio of about 0.5 to 1 of horsepower per ton. So there's a difference of, 500 between those numbers? It's kind of interesting. And so the reason for that is the third parameter that makes you into an engine engineer, which is called the duty cycle. Now, the ship engine is heavier by far than the engine in your vehicle because it has to run at its maximum or its cruise speed for years, 20 years, something like that. And that tends to be close to the maximum horsepower range too, because it's got a very narrow torque peak designed to run very efficiently at a certain speed and not too efficiently at other speeds. Your car is designed to run at very high horsepower for maybe a couple of minutes during its entire lifetime. So the duty cycle is very different.
Okay, I got to interrupt. What's torque?
Torque is the amount of impact that is delivered to the drive system to turn the wheels. Okay, so torque and horsepower is the rate at which that impact is delivered to the wheels. So horsepower goes up, the wheels will turn faster, but the amount of stress that's in the system actually goes down because the torque is going down. So it's kind of complex.
But this is why an electric vehicle, as soon as you press the accelerator, it's off like a rocket ship.
Right,
you can do
that's
0
correct.
to 60 times. Okay, whereas an ICE vehicle, you press down the accelerator and it's got to go through things. Hey, let's start moving pistons. Let's burn off some fuel. Let's cause little explosions.
Right, speed up the flywheel, store some energy in the flywheel, deliver that to the drive system. All those things have to happen.
Okay. Now I understand why they need a transmission, because you want to shift through and find the right point that it operates efficiently at.
That's right. You want to balance that, or if you want to go like hell, then you shift so that you can always operate in a very high RPM range. Of course, if you're always operating at maximum horsepower, you're not going to do that for very long because the engine isn't built to sustain that. So that's kind of the real marketing bullshit that's involved in a lot of these ICEs. They say, well, we produce 600 horsepower, 700, 500, whatever, but they never tell you how long you can sustain that horsepower. And it's typically only a matter of seconds before you're going to burn up the engine.
So 600 horsepower is like 600 horse shit, because you got to clean that all up, right?
It is. Well, we did talk about bullshift in the last
Ooh.
episode, I think. So anyway, for the people listening, if you're buying a car based upon the horsepower, you might want to consider what is the horsepower that's really needed and how long can this horsepower be delivered. If you've got a 500 horsepower car and you're driving that around, you will probably never, ever in your entire life operate that at 500 horsepower, because if you do, you're going to go like a rocket and you're going to be scared to death. So you are probably going to operate at a much lower RPM, much lower horsepower, and you will do that for a much longer period of time. So let's see. So if you go to a couple other things, if you go to a electric drive rather than an ICE, what are the parts that you no longer need in your vehicle? See, this is another side of the EVs. they can be much less expensive to build. So
Yeah. Back seats. You don't need back seats anymore.
don't need back seats, maybe that, but I was thinking more along the drivetrain. So if you have an electric motor, you don't need, what's the first part you don't need?
Oil.
Starts with C.
Coolant.
Combustion.
Combustion's a good one. Second letter is L.
Clothesline.
Sounds like the sound a hen would make.
A
What?
clucker. Oh, a
Clutch.
clutch. A clutch.
Hey, Anthony, you win. Good for you.
You were robbed, Michael.
You were great. You were great. Okay. So you can get rid of the clutch. If you have a two-wheel drive electric vehicle, what's another part that you can get rid of?
The mud tires.
The truck nuts.
I guess this is true for all electric vehicles. You no longer need a transmission because unless you've got a electric motor that's designed for only a very narrow operating speed, which you can do, but they don't ordinarily do that. Anyway, we talked about the reverse EMF. So you can in fact go ahead and ruin your electric motor by putting too much current in too quickly. So you need to balance that out. But another part that you can get if you get four-wheel drive on your vehicle with four independent electric motors, one on each tire, is you can get rid of the differential.
Yeah, I was gonna say you can get rid of traction control, right?
What is
software?
Why do you need a differential in a car, Michael?
What?
Transmit energy from the front to the back.
No, that's close. Hey, Anthony, what's your guess?
Well, because some people they drive differently. Like in England, they drive on the right side of the road, so there's a differential. And
That's a good answer.
When they bring the cars over on a cargo ship, they got to differentiate them.
That reminds me of a guy who answered a question in comparative vertebrate anatomy when I was in college. The question was, who was Andreas Vesalius? And the answer the guy gave is, it's a geometric or geological feature halfway between Mount Vesuvius and San Francisco, which was pretty good. I like it. He got full credit for the answer, even though it was wrong. No, differential is something you need in a car because when you go around a corner, the wheels turn at different speeds, right? Because the inside radius is different than the outside radius.
Playing with physics again, aren't you?
I'm sorry, I'm inclined to do that. This is actually geometry. When did you depart from the technical world, Anthony? Never mind.
I was thinking, come on, what's the centripetal force? There we go.
I'm only trying to point out that as you get deeper and deeper into the electric conversion of vehicles, there are many, many parts that are quite expensive and hard to build that you can leave out of the vehicle. So this is another reason why people want to go to electric vehicles. They can reduce the manufacturing cost and increase their profit margins associated with these once they get past the hurdle of these damn batteries that are so expensive. So that's another initiative for them. So I think maybe I've belabored this issue enough. Anything that we've left unclear here? Why can't they? Oh, one more thing. Why can't they use a boat motor in the Ford Mustang GT? Because if you have a 500 horsepower, you can get a 500 horsepower boat engine that you can generate the same amount of power as the Ford Mustang engine. So the difference is that the 500 horsepower boat engine weighs as much as the whole Mustang.
Right.
So this would make the Mustang a lot heavier. And so the question is, and you should know the answer to this now based upon the clues I've given you, why is the engine built for nautical duty in a ship so much heavier than the engine in a Mustang that produces the same amount of horsepower?
It's got to operate for a longer period of time at a consistent rate. And also boat engines are diesel because they don't use combustion because it's less of a fire hazard.
Anthony,
Bonus points?
You get a gold star, Anthony.
Yes!
You get a gold star.
I knew it. All right. Well, I think that wraps up our understanding of why an ICE vehicle needs a transmission and EVs don't. It'll all be better in the future when batteries are lighter, cheaper, and we all smell better. I think it's time for a little recall roundup.
Strap in. Time for the Recall Roundup.
Listeners, this is the first week we're inserting these little sound effects directly into the show, and it's making me giggle. All right, let's go into the first recall. We have another rear view camera problem. This is for Honda. It affects potentially 1.198 million vehicles. Honda is recalling certain 2018 to 2023 Odyssey, 2019 to 2022 Pilots, 2019 to 23 Passport vehicles due to a faulty media-oriented systems transport, which of course they give an acronym for, most. Basically, the coaxial cable to the rear view camera will disconnect, it looks like, or basically they can't get rear view cameras to work. I don't know why. Michael, you're muted. I told him he's muted.
He's still muted.
There you go.
Yeah, this was basically, there was a cable that connects the it's a media oriented cable is what it's called, the most cable.
It's just
which
a
makes me
coaxial
wonder
cable.
if it's also combining non-safety features in there but we don't know enough about it to determine that one way or the other. But this is a lot of I think the larger Honda vehicles. I think it's the minivan, the Passport, and the Pilot. So SUVs and minivans. And basically your rear view camera image isn't appearing on your display when you're backing up. And it looks like it's caused by a cable that got kinked. So what they're going to do is put in a new cable and install a straightening cover to keep it from kinking, apparently. But this follows just dozens of rear view camera recalls that we've seen the last couple of years, which appears to be a problem in the industry. They're having trouble getting these things up to code for FMVSS 111. There was another recall, I think, that I didn't put in there, Anthony. The Ford came out this morning with a do not charge warning, and it's for, let's see, 2019 to 20 Fusion hybrid. I think they're plug-in hybrids. So obviously they're plug-in hybrids if you're not supposed to charge it, right? And this is a battery engine control module that's damaged due to excessive voltage and current flow.
We were just talking about that.
Important. NHTSA should be highlighting that on their website later today, and the owners are going to be getting their letters probably in the next 3 weeks, it looks like. So they're coming out pretty quick with a remedy on this one.
But Ford, NHTSA is investigating whether Ford botched their runaway Explorer recall. So we got a lot of Ford issues happening here. And it looks like, so the automaker announced a recall of almost 253,000 Explorers in April, last April, because of a rear axle mounting bolt could fracture. And so the recall involved a software update, which hey, a bolt's broken. Let's apply some software to fix it. And
it's weird. Not only that, it's they actually did a fix on police vehicles, but consumers were given the software update. So similar to what happened, probably 10 years ago when the Crown Victorias were being hit in the rear and exploding. The police vehicles received an upgrade and the consumer vehicles did not. So which is great. I mean, I the police vehicles they do have more heavy duty parts and they do way more. So there may be something to that, but in this case, I don't know. It looks like Ford's trying to get away with a free call. And if you've been following us, that's when there is a physical problem with the vehicle that they're trying to put a Band-Aid on with a software update. That looks like what they did here. And now owners are coming back and complaining that it's not working or that it's causing other problems. And so NHTSA is going to go back and take a look at Ford's actions here and at the defect and see what's going on.
So Ford seems to have a lot of bolt issues. So you mentioned the one about the police as well, but they also have another parking one, and it looks like it's related to the primary control module software, but it's also that the rear axle bolt will break and the drive shaft can become disconnected, resulting in loss of transmission torque to the rear wheels, which is necessary to hold the vehicle in park. Look at this. It's 674 vehicles. They are the 2020 Ford Explorers, affected vehicles, a whole bunch of blah, blah, blah. on there. I'm not going to read through all of that. But hey, look, we're learning the word torque today. We're learning about bolts. Apparently, software can fix bolts. So, am I reading all this stuff wrong, Michael? It seems like it's all these rear axle bolts. Do they just get a bad batch of these things?
I don't know. It looks like they're recalling more vehicles than that, at least in the major recall. There's 700,000, so that's a really large bad batch. If so,
I mean, I imagine they buy these in bulk, but I mean, so that's what we have for recalls this week. And before we end, I think this touches on something that we've discussed before. How about touchscreens are awful, awful, awful. We've got a couple of good articles about how people are really disappointed with their new cars. And it's not because of performance or anything like that. It's because cup holders suck. And it's because no one can navigate their cars because everything's got touchscreen buttons, including we'll link to this article in thedrive.com where even the CEO of VW admits that their ID4 vehicles are annoying, not because the interior design, the physical design is bad. It's because of the ergonomics of where everything's located and how do you turn this on and that on. And it's like the Tesla problem when you scroll through 8 screens to find how to put the car in park. So hopefully they start working on better ergonomics and actually a physical button.
Yeah, it looks like people are really not happy. People have been complaining about touchscreens for the last few years at pretty high rates. I mean, they're burdensome. You can't get to things that you once got to pretty easily when buttons were popular. And VW basically said, we screwed up. We're going back to buttons from screens because our customers hate it. And I think we all pretty clearly see that it's a cost-cutting measure to, get everything centralized and not have multiple buttons running across the dashboard. But, consumers like that. I like buttons that do what they say when I touch them, and I do not want to scroll through any screens while I'm driving or when I'm not driving. I just want a button.
Yeah. I like the nice lag I get with the touchscreen, where I press something and I'm like, did it register?
You wait, a little spinning bar with
press it.
Yeah.
I don't even get a spinning bar. It just doesn't respond. So I press it again and then again and then again. And then I realize, I didn't even turn the car on.
Initiating braking sequence.
Right?
Hey, do we have time for an engineering nerd aside?
For you, all the time in the world.
All right.
Thanks, listeners. Goodbye. Oh, sorry.
No, we were talking about bad bolts before in the Ford. And there was an article I read once by an engineer who had analyzed the Titanic sinking. And what she came up with was that there was a manufacturing defect in the Titanic because at the time it was built, there was a shortage of steel rivets. And so the company used cast iron rivets instead of steel rivets in the Titanic. Now, the difference between those basically is that engineering term we talked about a couple of weeks ago called ductility, right? And ductility means basically that if it's ductile, it's not brittle. So it can stretch, it can move, and it won't break. Cast iron is very brittle, has very little ductility. So this engineer posited that because of the shortage of steel rivets at that time, they used cast iron rivets in the Titanic. And so when it hit the iceberg, because the rivets were inherently brittle, made of cast iron, and because it was cold, which made them even more brittle, the whole seam popped open rather than just the impact point, which caused the excessive water intake that couldn't be pumped out, which led to the Titanic sinking. Anyway, it just popped into my head. I thought I'd throw that in there. It's not relevant, but I do think it's interesting.
Well, as a representative of the finance department, I'd like to point out we did the math on this. We did the math on this, and we didn't think there was any chance of somebody driving into an iceberg. But that's it for now. Thank you so much, listeners.
That hardly ever happens. You're right.
You're right.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Next week we have off, but there'll be a compilation episode of all of our Consumer AV Bill of Rights. Download it, share with your friends over the holiday break. Bye-bye.
Dave Bohr, I think we need more acronyms.
For more information, visit www.autosafety.org.
You can talk now.
Oh, fine. Now that we're not recording, you're going to let me talk. This is a heresy.
No, we're still recording. This is how the show ends.
Uh-oh. I'm in trouble.